I want to give a quick shout out to my patrons. Thank you so much for your support. Hey y'all, it's Kate from the Literary Apothecary, and welcome back to my channel, and welcome back to another episode of Books My Boyfriend Gave Me. Now today we're going to be talking, if you couldn't tell by my Seth Rollins shirt, we're going to be talking about the book We Promised You a Great Main Event, an Unauthorized WWE History by Bill Hanstock. Now this video is going to be a little bit different than my other reviews, because I'm going to do my normal review of this first, and then I'm going to go part by part in the book and talk about each one of the parts, which talks about a part of WWE history and kind of what I learned and some of the things that stood out to me the most in those parts. Now, if you're an avid WWE fan, you already know a lot of this information, but I'm just becoming a new WWE fan, so I didn't know a lot of this. I learned a lot from this book. But first, let's talk about the book as a whole. My general thoughts. I gave this 5 out of 5 stars. As a WWE fan, I knew that I was going to like this book, but I didn't know just how much I would love it. In We Promised You a Great Main Event, Bill Hanstock pulls back the curtain on the WWE, Vince McMahon, the legends, and some of the most legendary moments and stories from WWE history. Hanstock does not hold back in his account of the WWE. So what worked for me in this book, this was written by a true fan, but he did not let his fandom interfere with telling all of the truth, or at least the perceived truth in this book. If you know anything about the WWE, you know that some of it is false, some of it is true, and it's up to the fans to determine really what's true and what's not. The illustrations in this book are really something special. When I get into each of the different parts, the reason why I wanted to talk about these different parts was to highlight those illustrations. So when I get to that part of this video, I'm going to have the illustrations up here as I talk about the different parts, just so you guys can see these incredible illustrations. So what I wanted more of in this book, wanted more of the women in WWE history. I know that women in WWE is more of a newer idea. They've gone through some weird phases with women, which I'll talk about a little bit as we go into this, but I wanted more of the women in WWE. Most of the focus was on the men, which is, you know, a lot of the focus in even the current WWE is the men. They get more airtime. They probably get more paychecks still. They get more promo time. They get more everything than the women. Along those same lines, I also wanted more of the recent times in WWE. This book spent a lot of time in the beginnings of WWE, which I really appreciated because I didn't know a lot about it back then. Spent a lot in the Middle Ages, kind of like from, you know, the very beginnings up until The Rock and Stone Cold in the late 90s comes through. But once we hit the 2000s, it kind of flies through it a lot. There's a lot less pages dedicated to the more recent years than the beginnings. And this book was published in 2020, so there's still a lot in between, like 2000 and 2020, that could have been covered that just kind of breezed through it. If you look at page numbers, a lot more pages were dedicated to, you know, those first decades of WWE, and then we hit 2000 and it kind of just glosses over them in comparison. So as you can see, like, I have taken a lot of notes because I wanted to make sure I covered everything. So I brought out my big notebook for this review. And also, you know, just going back to my last statement that I wanted more recent WWE history in here, it says on the Goodreads kind of synopsis of this book, it says that it's the most up-to-date history and book about the WWE, but, you know, because of that, we should have had more up-to-date stuff in it. So now I'm going to go through each one of the different parts that were in this book. I'll include the titles and of course the illustrations as I talk about them, and some things that I've learned in this book, and some things that stood out to me, things that I've remembered about it. And of course, this doesn't include everything that is in this book. That would be a forever long video if I included everything, and it would take away the point of doing a book review because you wouldn't need to go read the book. These are just some things that stood out to me as I read it, so take that as a grain of salt. Also take it as a grain of salt that, of course, I'm a beginner fan, so some of these things are obvious to people that have followed it through the years, and so just take that with a grain of salt too. But without further ado, let's get into it. So our introduction was titled, "You Know It's All Fake, Right?" And this introduction kind of introduced the book and how the book came to be, but also introduced Bill Hanstock as a fan of the WWE, and how he has covered the WWE in his sports writings. And it kind of plays at the fact that, especially growing up as kids, a lot of other kids would use the WWE to pick on other kids, saying that it's all fake, it's not real, and you know, whoever likes the WWE, that is supposed to reflect on them and their personality. I used to be one of those kids because I was raised by what we now call collegiate wrestling, the Olympic style wrestling, with, you know, the mats and everything, not the slamming of the WWE and all that kind of stuff, but the real hardcore mat wrestling, collegiate wrestling that people think of when some people think of when they think of wrestling. So I used to be one of those kids that, like, we grew up watching Hulk Hogan and Macho Man Randy Savage. We had the little pillow pals that we'd practice our moves on because mom said we couldn't practice on each other. But so we had that, but we also had my dad, who was a wrestling coach in high school and middle school, I think it was, giving us, you know, the collegiate, the Olympic wrestling background behind us. And we've got a whole mixture in the WWE of our superstar wrestlers with our UFC fighters, and, you know, people like Kurt Angle and Chad Gable, who grew up with that collegiate Olympic style wrestling. Kurt Angle was an Olympic gold medal winner with the wrestling of the Olympics. So the introduction was all about, you know, kind of an introduction to wrestling itself, the book, and the writer. And in our illustration here, we've got some iconic wrestlers from the WWE. Part one was all about the McMahon family and the very early years. So the very beginnings of this professional wrestling was a lot of, they called it the carny style. A lot about carnival type wrestling. You know, that's where we got people like Andre the Giant from. And we learned stuff about the McMahon family, like Vince McMahon grew up poor and idolized his dad, who had this wrestling business. He wanted to always be a wrestler himself, but his dad didn't want anything to do with him until Vince became, you know, a young man and took over the business from his father. Part two is where a lot of people remember what was then the WWF. That is Hulkamania, Steroids, and the new generation. So we've got Hulk Hogan and Andre the Giant and Macho Man Randy Savage. I learned in the, you know, infamous WrestleMania 3 match, which was Hulk Hogan versus Andre the Giant. This was so hyped up to be the match of the century, the biggest match that will ever happen. The WWF and Vince McMahon created these lies that surrounded Andre the Giant in this match, saying Andre the Giant had a 15-year win streak, which was totally false because he lost many times in those 15 years. And also that he had never been slammed, which was also false because it was kind of a rite of passage to be able to slam Andre in a match. When Andre allowed an opponent to slam him on the mat, that meant he respected that wrestler and he would allow that to happen. Andre was, he was a giant guy, 7 foot, almost 500 pounds. So if Andre didn't want to be slammed, he wasn't going to be slammed. There was also other claims by Hulk Hogan after the match happened that he tore all of the back muscles in his back by slamming Andre the Giant, which is completely false because his wrestling wasn't impacted physically by that match at all. He went on to wrestle many times after that in that year. Never lost a beat in his wrestling schedule. He also claimed one time that Andre died right after that match, which is 100% false, because not only did Andre live for several years after that, but he also wrestled for years after that, including matches against Hulk Hogan. So there were a lot of lies that surrounded the Hogan versus Andre the Giant match that kind of built up that match to live in history. But when you look at the actual facts of it, it wasn't so much of a great match, because quick match, and kind of Andre just let everything happen. Hulk Hogan rewrote the entire match like right before it happened. They weren't sure if Andre was going to go along with it or not, because he never verbally agreed to it. But it turned out that he kind of went along with it during the match, and everything kind of went to what Hulk Hogan and Vince McMahon laid out. In part 2, we also get the story of the Ultimate Warrior, who was supposed to be essentially the next Hulk Hogan. He went on a huge steroid craze. He became steroid mad, roid rage they called it, and they ended up having to go with Lex Luger, who was then the new Hulk Hogan. After Hogan left, after so many demands and Vince McMahon bending over backwards for Hulk Hogan, he left to go join WCW. So in that part, we also have the tragedy of Owen Hart and his death that happened right before a match on air. He was on a zip line. He was going to be dropping down into the mat, into the ring, and his quick release malfunctioned. And what I learned from that, I knew about Owen Hart's death, and how it impacted wrestling and especially the Hart family. But I didn't know that, his wife tried to talk him out of it before it happened, and he did several practice runs with no problem at all before it. It just happened to have a problem on air, led to his almost immediate death. He was rushed to the hospital and died before they finished airing that episode, and the announcers had to announce his death, and that led to the Harts trying to figure out, Bret Hart was his brother, and he was a huge star in the WWE, and the Harts had to figure out if they were going to stay with the WWE and what that would mean to the family and the legacy and Owen Hart's legacy, or if they were going to leave and go somewhere else, or even just leave wrestling in itself. So Bret Hart was the last to leave the WWE, and he was supposed to leave with the championship, is what they agreed to before the match in Montreal. He was going to retain the championship in his hometown of Montreal. And then Vince McMahon and Shawn Michaels, the Heartbreak Kid, decided to screw him over. It's known as the Montreal Screwjob, and they rung the bell before the match was over, giving Shawn Michaels the title and pissing off the entire Hart family. In part 3, we get the Attitude Era and the WWE monopoly. This is the late 90s, what a lot of people now remember the WWE as, with The Rock and Stone Cold Steve Austin. This is where we first really dive into the women of WWE. Back then, they were known as the Divas. We had Chyna, who was kind of the first woman star of the WWE, but she was first a bodyguard for Triple H. Triple H was then known as Hunter Helmsley's what the 3 H's stand for. I didn't write it down. People out there know what Triple H stands for. He was first, you know, this blue-blooded businessman. He had a totally different image. And he had China, who was this monster of a woman, as his bodyguard. And then people started seeing potential in China as a wrestler. And she took on the name of China and she became a wrestler on herself. We had Sable and Jacqueline Moore, who was the first black women's champion. Deborah and Ivy and Tori and Lita, who we saw come back this year, as a tag team with Becky Lynch, who we'll get to in just a minute. The Cat, you know, the Fabulous Moolah and Mae Young, who were these women in their 70s, still wrestling, still allowing grown men to slam them on the mat for the sake of WWE and the image. And then we get John Cena and the Ruthless Aggression era. John Cena was, you know, everyone knows who John Cena is. He was essentially the Vince McMahon wannabe kid. Everyone hated John Cena. All the fans just hated John Cena because he was a yes man. And then we had the tragedy of the Chris Benoit murders. Chris Benoit was supposed to be the next big wrestler. He was a fantastic wrestler, but he had that roid rage and it got to him. And the tragedy is that he, one day, right before he was supposed to win the championship, he killed his wife and his son and then killed himself. And the irony of this, besides, you know, the steroids and the tragedy of it, was right before Vince McMahon and the WWE learned of this tragedy, they had this whole fake Vince McMahon death set up. They had his limousine explode, blow up. They had a fake funeral set for him and everything. And then Vince McMahon had to come back and announce these murders. They had a whole, before they knew of what actually happened, they just knew this tragedy of Chris Benoit and his family dying, being dead, found dead in their house. While the police were investigating what actually happened, they did this whole tribute to Chris Benoit. Had wrestlers talk about him, Vince McMahon talk about him. Everyone was talking about how he was such a great wrestler and everything. And then after that aired, they learned what really happened and they had to take everything they said back. They've never said his name on air again. No one will speak of Chris Benoit again because of what happened, and they had to essentially renege that tribute, which is just a tragedy. It's the only way that you can describe it. So then in part 4, it was the TV PG, the reality era, and the money rolling in part. This was all about how after the WWE and Vince McMahon learned about everything that happened with Chris Benoit and his family, they had a stricter steroid testing policy. They had stricter concussion policies because not only did he have roid rage, but he also had severe concussions that in fact impacted his brain and his thinking. Doctors were given, his brain was donated to a bunch of doctors that studied his brain, and they said that because of the impacts on his brain from the multiple times his head was hit on the mat and on the rings and everything, his head was equivalent to an 85-year-old man with Alzheimer's, which is just so tragic. So in part 4, we get, after the Chris Benoit era, and the different policies that safety policies that come to effect. There is a new concussion policy that is pretty much the only policy that the WWE has really stuck to over the years since then. They had this new steroid policy that's been on and off through the ages because of different lawsuits and whatnot. In this part, we learn about the Nexus group, who is the NXT rookies coming up from essentially the developmental program, and they kind of take over the WWE on air, but people knew this was going to happen, but it wasn't scripted, so they didn't know what was going to happen. And Bryan Danielson kind of went too far with it and started bashing in an announcer or a referee, and they, cut him out of the WWE essentially. And then we get CM Punk breaking the fourth wall in his improv promo. He kind of told everyone exactly what he was thinking and peeled back the curtain on the WWE and the AFAB, and broke all of the rules of promos. We get the Shield, which was the beginnings of Seth Rollins. He's my favorite wrestler, current wrestler. As you can tell by my shirt, that's his song that the fans sing along to. Whoa. And that's his silhouette in color, because he always has the craziest outfits going on. He's a fantastic wrestler, but he started in the group The Shield, which was also with Roman Reigns and Dean Ambrose. And this was once Seth Rollins broke away from the Shield and, quote, went against the Shield. This was the start of the Roman Reigns era. We learned that when Roman Reigns first began as a single wrestler, fans absolutely hated him. They booed him so much. They thought he was going to be, the next John Cena, and they hated him until he announced on air that he has been battling leukemia, and he still has been battling leukemia. Then kind of fans did like an instant turnaround, and he's a heel, but people respect him, and some people even love him now, and they have the bloodline now with his cousins, the Usos, and Solo Sikoa. He's got Paul Heyman as his manager, and he is also known as, all of them are the cousins of The Rock. So we've got that era now. We've also gotten, women are now no longer divas, but now they're superstars. They're, at least in the fans' point of view, on the same line as the WWE male wrestlers. They're all superstars now. And so we've got Natalya, who is kind of the veteran of the women here in this new era. She's the niece of Bret and Owen Hart, and she's carrying on that Hart tradition. She does the sharpshooter as her finishing move, and she's one of my favorite women. At this time, we also get Charlotte Flair, daughter of Ric Flair, Becky Lynch, and Sasha Banks coming up from NXT into the WWE. They're known as the Four Horsemen, and they wrestle. Well, then we get people like Ronda Rousey coming in from the UFC. Also, we get UFC fighter Brock Lesnar coming in, and a different new way of wrestlers. We get the first ever women's main event match at WrestleMania. This was huge. Not only was it the first ever women's main event at WrestleMania, but it was also a triple threat. So we had Charlotte Flair, who was the SmackDown Women's Champion, and Ronda Rousey, who was the Raw Women's Champion, against Becky Lynch, who was essentially like the fans' favorite. Becky ended up winning this match and became two-belt Becky. And so this is kind of the start of the new era. A lot of the names that fans now recognize were in this part. This is where we get, Roman, like I said, Roman Reigns and Seth Rollins, and a lot of the now veteran wrestlers that are still wrestling are in this era. And then part 5 was all about NXT, what comes next for the WWE. We get The New Day and Kofi Kingston, who is another favorite. The New Day, I think, is my favorite tag team. We get Cody Rhodes, who is the son of Dusty Rhodes, the American Dream, and the brother of Goldust. He left the WWE because he wasn't getting what he wanted. He wasn't getting the limelight he wanted. They wouldn't give him the match of him versus his brother that he thought would make the big bucks. He went and started the Ring of Honor. And while he was on a podcast, a fan called in and asked how much he would bet that the Ring of Honor could have a sellout crowd of 10,000 plus fans in a venue like Madison Square Garden, which no one has ever done besides the WWE before. The announcer was like, no, that would never happen. And Cody Rhodes said, I'll take that bet. And they went on and sold out. They joined teams with New Japan Wrestling and sold out Madison Square Garden the same weekend as a WrestleMania at Madison Square Garden, which was unheard of. And then they went on to form AEW, which is essentially the wrestling brand that is now, you know, the competitor of WWE. And that was kind of the big moment in who is going to battle the WWE, because WWE now had this monopoly on professional wrestling entertainment, and no one since they bought out ECW, their other main competitor during the Monday Night Wars, which I didn't talk about, but that was a huge moment in WWE history. We now have AEW versus WWE, and the Wednesday Night Wars is what they were known as. I learned so much from this book, and it made me, I read this right after WrestleMania finished, and so it kept that excitement of WrestleMania for me, and I learned so much. I couldn't talk about everything that I learned in here because I don't have it all in my head, and I wouldn't do it justice, but I wanted to talk about some of the things that I learned in here, just to show just how much this book covered. It covered everything. Even stuff I didn't talk about in here, I bet you it covered it in here. If you're a big WWE fan, let me know in the comments below. Of course, who's your favorite wrestler, either past or present? What moments stand out to you the most in WWE history? I'll let you know if those are covered in this book. If you are a WWE fan, you want to read this book. This was a fantastic book. It was excellently written. It had personality. It had facts. It had personal stories. It had stories from people in the business then. It was a great book. 5 out of 5 stars for me. And I'm going to round it out here saying, you know, as always, come to my Discord and talk about WWE with me, because I've become a huge fan. As you can tell, I've got merch now. And I love talking about the WWE, and I don't have anyone besides John that I can talk to about it. So come talk to me on Discord about it. As always, of course, my Discord and Patreon information will be in the description below. Keep reading, and I love y'all to the moon and back. Bye.